So welcome back to Unit 3, Culture, Part 2 of our two-part series. Thanks for hanging in there with us. So in this particular video, you can learn a little bit more about culture. In our first part, we looked at understanding culture, and in the second part of this video, we're going to be looking at some different concepts surrounding the different elements of culture. You can follow along in Chapter 3 of your textbook. So the first concept we're going to look at is something called cultural universals, and those are practices that are found in almost every culture. Some examples are language, sports, religious ceremonies, ritual gift-giving, laws, and music. So it doesn't mean that they're identical, it just means that they're common practices found in every culture. Right? And while practices are universal, the context around them varies, and so they may look different. Let's look at a wide variety of sports. While sports may be a cultural universal found in almost every culture, the practices and the contexts vary. Whether it's sumo wrestling, or caber tossing, or surfing, Wide variety of sports available in different cultures because the contexts in which they manifest are very different. The next concept I want to look at is cultural innovation. We know that humans are creative, and there's always new technologies and products that are being produced, and we know that these innovations have a really significant cultural impact. Look at cell phones and the impact that it's had on communication, and how communication is very different today than it was even 10 years ago. Look at computer technology. This is a prototype out of Japan. Imagine carrying your computer around as a little pen in your pocket with a hollow projection screen and a keyboard, and when your fingers break the light, it actually types. Or this as your computer. Or this is your classroom. This is Jeffrey Hahn, and he's a professor at NYU. This is what his classroom looks like. Jeffrey Hahn is well known for many advances in touchscreen technology. Or driving your car, but not really driving it. And look at, since COVID-19, the many ways in which innovations have come to now meeting with people online. In healthcare, we've seen some new advances in cancer that are really quite groundbreaking. One of these is the use of scorpion paint. So they've taken the venom of scorpion and added it with some agents that, when injected into the tumor, lights it up, so that when surgeons are actually operating, they can ensure that they remove all aspects of the tumor. It's often very difficult to differentiate tumor tissue from the other surrounding tissue around it, particularly in the brain. And tumor paint helps to ensure that tumors don't occur by ensuring that the surgeons are able to remove all tumor cells. And look at this healthcare innovation. It's available at Sunnybrook in Toronto. It's the world's first machine to fuse radiation and MRI. So it targets tumors very precisely and monitors their response to radiation with unprecedented precision. So even as the tumor moves, it can adjust to that. Let's look at two other concepts in culture: diffusion and globalization. Diffusion is when cultural items or practices are transmitted from one group to another. And globalization is the worldwide integration of government policies, cultures, social movements that's accelerated cultural diffusion. Let's look at some examples. We've seen with Pokemon and Pokemon Go. This is a perfect illustration of how globalization influences diffusion. These Canadians are playing Pokemon Go, a Japanese creation, in Winnipeg. And look at the example of McDonald's. The golden arches are recognized around the world, but diffusion sometimes does make it specific to the culture and the social context in which it's found. This is in Cairo, Egypt, where you can have McDonald's delivered via this vehicle to your door. Or look at this, the golden arches next to the banner of the Communist Party. And how do you know that Grandma's actually eating a fillet of fish? And this is Ronald McDonald, but here Ronald's doing a traditional Thai greeting. One of my favorites, this sign says in Spain that you're not allowed to be served alcohol to any minors under the age of 16. So you can go to McDonald's in Spain and get a beer with your meal if you're over the age of 16. We see Maharaja Max. We see kimchi burgers. And we see McLobsters. All examples of cultural diffusion. The next concept I want to talk about is subcultures, and those are a segment of a culture that has characteristics that distinguish it from the broader culture. So the subculture has its own distinctive values, norms, behaviors, and individuals can belong to more than one subculture at a time. Examples are religious groups, such as Hutterites, Mennonites, or ethnic groups. Many subcultures have their own language, and this specialized language that distinguishes a subculture from the wider culture is called an argot. Let's take a look at an example. So let's take a look at something called prison argot. That's a specialized language that is used in prison that wider society might not understand the terms of. And these terms are taken from a book called Untwisted, written by Serge Leclerc, who went on to become a member of government in the West Coast, but in his younger life spent most of his years inside federal and provincial prisons. And he's written a book called Untwisted about his life. In it he provides the prison argot for these following terms. Take a few minutes. Do you think you know what they mean? Fishes usually commonly understand, but do you know what a go-boy is? A mule, a skin fan, a screw, a shank, or a wolf? Let's see if you were able to guess these. So obviously a fish is a new prisoner. Go-boy is the name of a person who's escaping from prison, and as someone's escaping, other prisoners will often chant, "Go boy, which means run away. A mule is a person who brings drugs into prison from the outside. A skin fan is a strip search by guards for contraband. Screws are the name that's used for guards. Shank is the name that's used inside prison for homemade prison knives. And wolf is an inmate who is straight on the outside but a same-sex sexual predator on the inside. Next, let's look at the concept of countercultures. Those are a subculture that rejects conventional norms and values and adopts alternatives, usually nonconformist, and they're at odds with the larger society. Some examples include the hippie movement in the 1960s, organizations like the Hells Angels, or different types of movements, punk, goth, as some examples. The next concept I want to take a look at is called culture shock, and that's a feeling of uncertainty and disorientation when we encounter new or different cultural practices. So oftentimes when people move from one country to another country, they can experience something called culture shock. And those are kind of highs and lows, bends and dips that make you feel uncertain and make you feel disoriented. Oftentimes, this is the kind of wave that people will experience when they're moving to a new country. In the beginning, everything is new and it's exciting and it's different and it's almost like you're on a holiday. But over a period of time, you can begin to experience some frustration and annoyance because everything is not the same as it was back home. And then you can have a bit of a high and it looks like you've actually adjusted on the surface, but then you can dip again because you begin to confront the deeper, remember when we talked about culture, the things below the surface of the water. We're talking about personal issues and value differences and belief differences, which can really cause some adjustment issues. But also that dip also reflects structural issues within a society. So it may at this point be hard for people to find employment or find friends. And then it can upswing to adaptation and eventual integration into the host society. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to evaluate other people's cultures based on our own cultural lens. So we see our own culture as superior to other cultures, and we use that to measure and evaluate other cultures. Cultural relativism is the attempt to understand cultures on their own terms. So we're attempting to understand why cultural practices exist rather than judging them, like we might do with ethnocentrism. The understanding does not necessarily involve supporting or agreeing with a cultural practice, but trying to understand why it actually exists. So in your textbook, Sarah Cummings has given you an exercise on practicing cultural relativism, and I just want to go through that with you. So in the textbook, it suggests that our perception is often tied to our cultural understanding and our upbringing, and that this varies by where we live, the time in which we're living, the social context around us. And so she gives us a triangle to take a look at how we value different objects. So I'm going to give you different animals, and as I show these animals to you on the screen, I want you to think about whether that animal represents a pet to you. Does the animal represent a pest? Or is the animal a source of food for you? Remember, as you're looking at these images, other people in our class might see them very differently based on the place and context that has formed their culture. So a cat, is that a pet, a pest, or food? A dog, is that a pet, a pest, or food? How about a rat? How about fish? Sometimes they can be more than one thing. How about a cow? Sometimes they don't fit any at all. Some people never eat pork, and sometimes it's important to understand why that cultural practice actually happens. Insects, are they pests? Are they food? Or are they pets? How about shrimp? How about horses? How about snakes? How about guinea pigs? As we saw from our last example, they can be both pet and food. How about tarantulas? We also looked at those being both pets and foods, and for many people pests too. Xenocentrism is a preference for a culture other than one's own. So, for example, the assumption that products produced in other countries are always superior to domestic products. So, I'm creating this video in the Niagara region, and I live in a region here where we're well known for our wine. Niagara produces some of the best wines in Ontario and Canada, if not the world. Niagara College itself has its own winemaking program and has many award-winning labels. But xenocentrism works in such a way that people may say, yeah, I don't really want to buy Niagara wine because I think, for example, wine from France is the best wine in the world. Or I think wine from Italy is the best. Or I think wine from Chile is the best. The same as we might do with Belgian chocolate. Or cars. Multiculturalism is a concept. It exists at a level of understanding where many different cultures can coexist under one sort of policy. Canada was really the first country in the world to actually adopt a formal policy on multiculturalism, which eventually became law in 1985. So multiculturalism actually mandates equality before the law, and it protects people from discrimination. It protects language rights. It allows people to practice any religion and allows people to maintain their own ethnic and social identities. Multiculturalism also exists as a form of identity, and it is an important part of Canadian identity, protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So let's summarize our key points from Unit 3. We know culture is learned, that each culture follows norms that are passed generationally. They are instilled and enforced through positive and negative sanctions. We know that material culture includes all physical objects that a society creates and uses, and non-material cultures include the values, beliefs, norms, and sanctions of any given group. We know that cultural universals are practices known in almost every human culture, although they can vary. We know cultures expand through innovation, diffusion, and globalization, and that both subcultures and countercultures exist in every society. We know that ethnocentrism can lead to prejudice and discrimination, and we should attempt to practice cultural relativism in order to increase understanding. Coming up next is Unit 4, Socialization.